In Henley-on-Thames, hidden behind iron gates on Gravel Hill, stands one of England's most extraordinary estates. Friar Park is not what it appears to be from the road. The Victorian mansion with its Gothic towers and pinnacles hints at grandeur. But the real story lies beyond, in 30 acres of gardens that defy belief. An underground lake you can row through in darkness. A 20-foot replica of the Matterhorn built from Yorkshire stone. Caves filled with optical illusions. A Japanese garden copied from an 1893 illustration. Medieval herb gardens reconstructed from 15th century paintings. Stepping stones that make visitors appear to walk on water. This is not a typical English country estate. This is the vision of one man, an eccentric Victorian lawyer who spent 2 decades and a fortune creating what he called his Museum of Gardens. Sir Frank Crisp built Friar Park between 1889 and 1895. He filled it with humor, puzzles, and inscriptions. He employed 45 gardeners. He installed friars holding frying pans and garden gnomes in caves. He carved mottos into stone, "Don't keep off the grass." He created a world where nothing was quite what it seemed. When Crisp died in 1919, the estate passed through other hands. By the late 1960s, Friar Park was falling apart. The gardens were overgrown. The mansion was occupied by nuns running a convent school. Demolition seemed likely. Then, in January 1970, a 27-year-old beadle named George Harrison paid £140,000 for the property. He spent years restoring what Crisp had built. He installed a recording studio that would produce some of the most important albums of the 1970s. He wrote songs inspired by the inscriptions Crisp had carved into the walls. Harrison once said that Friar Park was as much about Sir Frank Crisp as it was about him. He saw himself as a caretaker of something extraordinary, a Victorian folly that deserved to survive. This is the story of that estate, from a lawyer's weekend retreat to a Beatles creative sanctuary, from the largest rock garden in England to a recording studio that rivaled Abbey Road, from Victorian eccentricity to rock and roll history. If you enjoy explorations of historic estates and the people who created them, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let's begin with the man who started it all, the eccentric lawyer who built a fantasy world in the Oxfordshire countryside. Chapter 1. The Eccentric Lawyer's Dream. Frank Crisp was born in London on October 25, 1843. He came from a family that valued education and hard work. His mother died when he was young. His grandfather, John Philby Childs, raised him. Frank studied at the University of London, earning degrees in arts and law. In 1869, he qualified as a solicitor. He was brilliant at his profession. Within years, he became a partner at Ashurst, Morris and Crisp, a prestigious London law firm located at 17 Throgmorton Avenue. The firm still exists today, over a century later. The young lawyer handled some of the most important commercial contracts of the Victorian era. He drew up agreements for the construction of battleships for the Japanese Navy. He worked on the cutting of the Cullinan diamonds, some of the largest diamonds ever found. He helped form the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would eventually become British Petroleum. The work made him wealthy, very wealthy. Sources suggest he earned reportedly as much as 55% of his firm's profits. He also invested early in new technologies, telephones and electricity. His firm represented the inventors and manufacturers of these innovations in the capital. He had inside knowledge about which technologies would succeed. Investment followed accordingly. By the mid-1880s, Frank was one of London's most successful lawyers. He lived with his family in a large house in Holland Park called Clyde House. The residence was substantial, built of stock brick with stucco trim, designed to accommodate a large family and numerous servants. His family included his wife Catherine, 2 daughters, and 4 sons. Clyde House was comfortable. But like many wealthy Victorian gentlemen, he wanted something more. A country estate where the family could escape the capital's noise and crowds, a place for weekends and parties, a place to pursue his passions. And Frank had passions beyond law. He was deeply interested in botany. He served as treasurer and later vice president of the Linnean Society, a learned society dedicated to natural history, evolution, and taxonomy. He was fascinated by alpine plants, medieval gardens, and horticultural history. He was also an amateur microscopist. He belonged to the Royal Microscopical Society and donated furniture, books, and instruments to the organization. He published technical papers on microscopy. But perhaps most importantly, the solicitor had a sense of humor, a playful personality. He loved puzzles, optical illusions, puns, and jokes. He delighted in creating things that surprised and confused people. This combination, wealth, botanical knowledge, and whimsy, would shape everything he built. In the mid-1880s, he began looking for land outside the capital. He wanted space, room for extensive gardens, a place where he could experiment with landscape design and create something extraordinary. He chose Henley-on-Thames. Henley was already famous by the 1880s. The town had hosted a rowing regatta since 1839. In 1851, Prince Albert became patron of the event, elevating its status. By 1891, Kelly's directory described Henley as the prettiest summer retreat in the county, surrounded by handsome villas and plantations, a very favorite and fashionable place of resort. The area around Henley contained numerous grand estates: Badgemore House, Folly Court, Greenlands, Gray's Court, and others. Wealthy Londoners built country homes there. The location offered picturesque views, proximity to the capital, and a fashionable social scene. Frank saw potential for something different. Not just another country house, something unique. In 1889, he began purchasing land on the western edge of Henley. The property consisted of two separate plots, each with its own house and driveway. One was called Friar's Field. The other was called Friar Park. The names had no religious significance. They likely came from surnames of previous owners. But the new owner kept the name Friar Park for his estate, and would make friars a central theme of everything he built. He immediately ordered both existing houses demolished. He would start fresh, build exactly what he wanted. By 1900, Sir Frank had reportedly spent £150,000 on the project. That's equivalent to roughly £20 million in 2020 currency, an extraordinary sum for a weekend retreat. But this was never going to be just a weekend retreat. This was going to be his masterpiece, his museum of gardens, a place where he could combine his knowledge of botany, his love of history, his skill at creating optical illusions, and his irrepressible sense of humor. He hired landscape architect Henry Ernest Milner to design the grounds. Milner was one of the leading garden designers of the Victorian era. His task was to lay out the approach, determine placement of features, and create a landscape that would astonish visitors. The owner gave Milner a quarter-mile-long driveway to work with, curving through the property, revealing gardens gradually, building anticipation for the house itself. But Frank didn't just hire Milner and step back. He was intimately involved in every decision. The landscapes at Friar Park would reflect his personality, knowledge, and imagination at every turn. He wanted themed gardens representing different periods and styles, medieval plantings copied from 15th century manuscripts, Elizabethan designs based on 16th century books, a Japanese garden replicated from contemporary illustrations, an alpine rock garden unlike anything England had seen. He wanted underground caves you could row through, lakes with optical illusions, grottos filled with stalactites and stalagmites, secret passages, hidden surprises. He wanted inscriptions everywhere, mottos, puzzles, jokes carved into stone and wood throughout the property. He wanted visitors to constantly discover something unexpected. Most of all, he wanted to fill the estate with friars, stone friars, terracotta friars, friar statues holding frying pans, friars with tongues sticking out, friars everywhere, reminding visitors that this was Friar Park, a place where the owner's sense of humor was as important as the botanical accuracy of the plantings. Frank was knighted in December 1907 for his legal work. He was created a baronet in February 1913 for services as legal advisor to the Liberal Party. From that point forward, he was Sir Frank, but the title meant less to him than the estate he was creating. Friar Park was where he could be himself, not the serious solicitor handling contracts for battleships and oil companies, but the playful Victorian gentleman who loved gardens, jokes, and surprising his guests. By 1895, construction of the main house was complete. The landscapes would continue to evolve for another 2 decades. Sir Frank would employ 45 full-time gardeners to maintain the property, and he created a detailed guidebook for visitors, explaining the features, the plants, the historical references. He wanted people to understand what they were seeing, to appreciate the thought and knowledge behind every garden, every cave, every inscription. Sir Frank poured his personality into Friar Park. The estate became an extension of himself, eccentric, knowledgeable, playful, surprising. A place where a brilliant lawyer could also be an artist, a prankster, a collector of curiosities. When visitors passed through the gates on Gravel Hill, they entered his world. A world where nothing was quite what it seemed, where walking on water was possible, where caves contained collections of gnomes, where inscriptions challenged you to think. Friar Park was never meant to be just beautiful. It was meant to be extraordinary. And for the next 3 decades, until his death in 1919, it would be exactly that. The most remarkable private garden in England, created by one of the most eccentric men of the Victorian era. Chapter 2. Acquiring the Land, 1889. The land Frank Crisp purchased in 1889 consisted of 2 separate properties. Friar's Field occupied the eastern portion. Friar Park, the original name, covered the western side. Each had its own residential structure. Each had its own entrance drive. Both were modest Victorian properties with small gardens and limited acreage. They were not what he wanted. He ordered both houses demolished immediately. The land would be unified under a single name. Everything would be built fresh, according to his specifications. The location was ideal. Henley-on-Thames in the late 1880s was already famous throughout England. The rowing regatta, established in 1839, had grown into a major social event after Prince Albert became its patron in 1851. By 1891, Kelly's Directory described the town as the prettiest summer retreat in the county, surrounded by handsome villas and plantations, a very favorite and fashionable place of resort. The area attracted wealthy Londoners seeking country estates. Grand properties dotted the landscape: Badgemore House, Folly Court, Greenlands, Gray's Court, Harpston Court, Park Place, and many others. The fashionable set spent weekends there. Social gatherings and parties filled the calendar. But Frank didn't choose this location because it was fashionable. He chose it for practical reasons. The distance from London allowed comfortable weekend visits. The journey could be made easily, yet it felt worlds away from the capital's crowds and noise. The terrain offered possibilities. His acquired land sat on a hillside on the western edge of town. The ground sloped downward from west to east, providing views over the settlement toward the Thames. Natural contours, hills and valleys, could be enhanced or modified to create interesting landscapes. The soil and climate would support the botanical experiments he wanted to conduct. The area received adequate rainfall. The temperature was moderate. He could grow alpines, herbs, exotic species, and traditional English plants all on the same acreage. Most importantly, he'd secured enough space. The combined plots totaled approximately 30 acres. That was sufficient room for everything he envisioned. Extensive plantings representing different historical periods and styles, water features, caves, structures, and the main residence itself. The existing structures on both plots were torn down in 1889. The old Friar's Field house was demolished for materials. Contemporary newspaper accounts from the Henley Advertiser in November 1895 record that it sold at auction for £240. With the land cleared, Frank kept the name Friar Park for the entire estate. The name had no religious significance. It likely derived from surnames of previous owners. But it suited his purposes perfectly. He'd already decided on a theme. Friars would become a recurring motif throughout the grounds. Stone friars, terracotta friars, carved friars, friar statues, friar jokes and puns. The name gave him license to fill his estate with playful religious imagery that poked fun at Victorian propriety. The next step was engaging professionals who could help realize his vision. He hired landscape architect Henry Ernest Milner to lay out the terrain. Milner was one of the leading designers of the Victorian era. His 1890 book, The Art and Practice of Landscape Gardening, was the standard reference for professionals throughout Britain. Milner had worked on major estates across the country. He understood how to create dramatic approaches, how to reveal landscapes gradually, how to use topography to create surprise and interest, how to accommodate both formal and naturalistic planting schemes. But working with Frank would be different from typical commissions. Most clients told Milner what they wanted in general terms, then let him design. This client had very specific ideas about everything. He'd researched medieval horticulture, studied alpine plants, examined Japanese design principles, and developed detailed plans for themed areas representing different styles. Milner's role was to make these ideas work in the actual landscape, to ensure proper drainage, to create paths that made sense, to position features where they'd have maximum impact, to translate botanical and historical concepts into physical reality. The collaboration between them would continue for years. Milner would provide the professional foundation. His employer would supply endless specific requirements, historical details, and insistence on authenticity. Together, they began planning an approach drive that would wind a quarter-mile from the entrance gates up to the house. Plantings would be positioned along the route to build anticipation. Visitors would catch glimpses of water, paths leading into woods, unexpected features around curves. The topography made this possible. The entrance on Gravel Hill sat at a lower elevation than the house site. The drive would climb gradually, curving through what would become the lower sections, passing the planned lake, winding through wooded areas, eventually reaching the plateau where the main residence would stand. Milner also began laying out positions for the various themed sections Frank wanted. An alpine rock garden on the northwest slope, medieval and Elizabethan plantings in one area, a Japanese garden in another, herb beds, rose collections, a topiary display. Each would occupy its own defined space within the larger landscape. The scale was ambitious. Victorian estates often had impressive grounds. But Frank wanted something more comprehensive. He wanted what he called a museum of gardens, a collection of different styles and periods all within a single property. Visitors would move from one distinct environment to another, each botanically and historically accurate. By 1890, the basic framework of Milner's design was in place. The approach was laid out. Areas for major features were designated. Paths were beginning to take shape. But the real work was just beginning. The plantings themselves would take 2 decades to complete. Tens of thousands of specimens would be imported and established. Massive construction projects, the Alpine Rock Garden, underground caves, artificial lakes, lay ahead. First, though, structures needed to be built. Lodges for staff, the main residence, greenhouses and work buildings, the architectural elements that would provide the framework for everything else. Frank turned his attention to construction. He had clear ideas about what he wanted: Victorian Gothic fantasy, elaborate details, color and visual complexity, structures that would surprise and delight visitors just as much as the landscapes themselves. The property on Gravel Hill was ready. The plans were drawn. The vision was clear. Between 1889 and 1900, he would reportedly spend £150,000 bringing Friar Park to life. That sum, equivalent to roughly £20 million in 2020 currency, represented an extraordinary investment for a weekend retreat. But this was never about creating just another country estate. This was about building something unique. A place where Victorian wealth, botanical knowledge, historical research, and playful humor would combine into an experience found nowhere else in England. The land was acquired, the designer was hired, the vision was set, construction could begin. Chapter 3: The Mansion and Entry Gates. Building Friar Park required an architect who understood what Frank wanted. He hired Robert Clark Edwards. Edwards was not a fashionable name. The leading architects of the Victorian era, those building grand country houses for aristocracy, were designing in various styles. Some favored Renaissance revival, others preferred Queen Anne. Tudor revival was popular. Classical styles endured. Edwards worked in Gothic, specifically flamboyant Gothic, the exuberant late medieval French style characterized by elaborate tracery, complex roof lines, and ornamental excess. More importantly, Edwards was willing to work from his clients' own designs, because the residence at Friar Park was very much its owner's creation. He'd studied architecture. He knew what he wanted. Edwards provided technical expertise and ensured the structure would actually stand, but the vision belonged to Frank. The style chosen was deliberate. Not the austere medieval Gothic of churches, not the restrained Gothic revival popular earlier in the century. Flamboyant Gothic meant drama, color, visual complexity, irregularity, and picturesque silhouette. The building would be constructed of red brick with contrasting light masonry dressings. Terracotta ornaments would add additional color and detail. Multiple towers, turrets, and pinnacles would create an asymmetrical profile that looked different from every angle. Construction began in 1889. The builder was Charles Clements of Henley, a local firm capable of handling the scale and complexity required. But before the main residence, Frank built the lodges. 3 structures would serve as gatehouses and staff residences. The lower one near the entrance on Gravel Hill, the middle one along the southern boundary, the upper one on the southwestern edge of the property. Each would be designed in the same flamboyant Gothic style. Red brick, light masonry dressings, steeply pitched roofs covered with rectangular clay tiles, cross gables, tall, ornate chimneys with decorative brickwork, elaborate window moldings. The lower structure came first. It would house Philip Knowles, the head gardener who would also serve as estate manager. The building needed to be substantial, not just a cottage, a proper residence befitting the senior staff member who would oversee 45 gardeners and maintain 30 acres of complex landscapes. It stands 1.5 stories high. The entire roof is covered with rectangular red clay tiles. The combination of fiery red brick and light masonry creates stark contrast against surrounding greenery. Sources suggest Frank had this structure built, then completely demolished, then rebuilt until it met his satisfaction. Whether literally true or Victorian exaggeration isn't entirely clear, but it illustrates his perfectionism. Nothing would be completed unless it matched his vision exactly. The building is so grand that visitors often mistook it for the main residence. When George Harrison later brought friends to Friar Park, several thought this was where he lived. Chris Odell, Harrison's friend and assistant, initially assumed this was his new home. The entrance gates were equally elaborate. 4 tall piers constructed of red brick with masonry coping and banding. Heavy iron carriage gates in the center. Ornamental pedestrian gates on each side. The outer piers are topped with friar heads, larger than life-size, carved, keeping watch over all who enter. The 2 inner piers are surmounted by cast iron lamps, but the piers themselves are where imagination ran wild. Carvings cover every surface: the fall, Noah and the Ark, angel heads, devil faces, a sphinx, dragons, flying horses, winged serpents, mythical creatures, reclining monks, bizarre faces with tongues sticking straight out. This was humor immediately on display. Before visitors even entered the property, they encountered the unusual and unexpected. Just inside the gates, he placed a sign. It read, "Don't keep off the grass." The double negative confused people. Could you walk on the grass or couldn't you? Visitors stood there perplexed, trying to parse the logic. Sources suggest people debated the meaning, unsure whether the grass was permitted or forbidden. That was exactly the reaction Frank wanted. His property would constantly challenge assumptions about what was proper, what was allowed, what made sense. The middle structure was built along the southern boundary. It could be approached from a path of crushed quarry tile or accessed directly from Gravel Hill through a pedestrian gate. It followed the same Gothic style, red brick, masonry dressings, cross gables, clay tile roof, arched casement windows with transoms, all within elaborate light frames. Each window was designed as a composition, the Gothic arch, the surround, the proportion all carefully considered. Above the entry, Frank installed a frieze inspired by Charles Blondin, the famous French acrobat who'd walked across Niagara Falls on a tightrope in 1859. Another example of playful references scattered throughout the property. Victorian visitors would have recognized the reference immediately. When George Harrison installed his recording studio decades later, visiting musicians often stayed here. The band Splinter occupied it while recording. Klaus Voormann lived there during at least one period. The upper structure was built on the southwestern portion of the estate. It housed the coachmen who managed horses and carriages. Again, the same flamboyant Gothic style. Multi-cross-gabled roofs with rectangular and fishtail-shaped clay tiles. 3 very tall, thin chimneys in symmetrical pattern with colored-cut bricks. Decorative eave molding along the steeply pitched gables. With the 3 gatehouse buildings complete and occupied, construction of the main residence began in earnest. The mansion sits on a plateau at the highest point of the property. The location provides commanding views eastward over the descending landscapes toward Henley and the Thames beyond. The structure is substantial. The facade runs roughly 130 feet across. Red brick construction with horizontal light bands, dressings, and trim. The roof features multiple asymmetrical cross gables and steeply pitched towers and turrets with pyramidal shapes. Everything is covered in rectangular red tiles. Numerous tall, thin chimney stacks rise from the roof. Each is designed with ornate symmetrical patterns, bands of colored cut bricks and light masonry, capped with terracotta pots and cowls. Victorian chimneys were practical necessities. Every fireplace required its own flue. But Frank turned functional requirements into decorative opportunities. The architectural complexity is deliberate. Nothing is symmetrical. Nothing is simple. Towers and turrets of different heights and shapes create picturesque irregularity. Gothic windows of various sizes punctuate the brick walls. Tracery adds delicate detail to openings. The south facade, the entrance front, makes an immediate impression. On the right side, a polygonal bay roughly 12 feet wide rises to a balcony, then continues to a pyramidal roof and finial. To the left of that, the dining room wall extends about 30 feet. A large sundial sits in the center, framed and covered with inscriptions and engravings. The main entrance occupies the center. A double Tudor-shaped arch below an elaborately carved balcony. 6 reptilian gargoyles look down from above. Mythical creatures that would drain water from the roof while simultaneously unnerving visitors below. Below that, a terracotta hood mold surrounds the entry to the exterior hall. Outside the main entrance, Frank placed a carving. A friar holding a battered frying pan. The caption reads, "2 holy friars." It's a pun. 2 holes in the frying pan, 2 holy friars. Visual humor carved in masonry. His personality was inescapable from the moment visitors approached the door. Above the entry, a chronogram reveals the year 1895, the date the residence was first occupied. The inscription translates from Latin, "Welcome friends as many as wish to enter. Come in peace. Eat, drink, live merrily. In peace, depart." The message was genuine. Frank built Friar Park to share. He wanted visitors. He created guidebooks explaining features. He welcomed guests to explore the grounds. The estate was meant to be experienced, not merely observed from a distance. Visitors entered through a vestibule 20 feet long and 10.5 feet wide. The floor bore a Latin inscription, "Tell not all you know. He who tells all that he knows often tells more than he knows." Advice about discretion, carved into the entry floor. Another example of embedding wisdom and humor into the physical structure itself. Inside, the lavish entrance hall stretched 20 feet deep and 10 feet wide. The walls featured sumptuously carved wood and masonry with gold-colored ornamentations. Uniquely designed lights extended from the walls, Not standard Victorian fixtures, but custom pieces that match the Gothic aesthetic. The floor was shiny marble. Further along, a colorful tiled mosaic seemed too beautiful to step upon. Every surface received attention. Every detail was considered. Carved double doors led to the Jacobean Hall. 36 feet by 35 feet with a 37-foot-high ceiling. Paneled in richly carved oak. A long vestibule led to a richly carved oak staircase that would later appear in photographs for Harry Nilsson's 1972 album, Son of Schmilson. Under the stained glass windows stood a 20-foot-high fireplace. 2 panels represented lines from Alfred Lord Tennyson's 1850 poem, Ring Out Wild Bells, from In Memoriam. Ring out the old, ring in the new, ring out the false, ring in the true. These specific lines would inspire George Harrison's 1974 song, Ding Dong Ding Dong. Harrison discovered the inscription carved into the fireplace and incorporated the words directly into his lyrics. At the top of the staircase, a gallery on the floor above provided access to chambers of various sizes. The residence contained 25 bedrooms. Some were family rooms, others were guest chambers. Additional rooms housed servants. The windows throughout were designed by British artist Edward Burne-Jones, a leading figure in the pre-Raphaelite and arts and crafts movements. His stained glass work featured medieval-inspired designs that complemented the Gothic architecture. The southeast side contained the grand dining room, 34 feet by 22 feet, with 12.5-foot ceilings. The ceiling featured heavily beamed and subdivided oak. A beautiful fireplace with built-in seating, columns, and sculptures, all carved in oak, dominated one wall. Next to the dining room were the library and study. These would become Frank's private spaces, where he worked on botanical research, wrote articles on microscopy, and planned additions to his landscapes. At the end of the hall, carved satinwood doors opened to a double drawing room. 42 feet by 23 feet, 3 recesses. The 13-foot-high ceilings were painted like a summer sky with fluffy clouds and birds sitting in honeysuckle branches. Cherubs floated among the clouds. This room served as the ballroom when Frank hosted large gatherings. Victorian society required appropriate space for entertaining. The room could accommodate substantial numbers of guests for music, dancing, or theatrical presentations. Perhaps no interior detail better reflected his humor than the light switches. They were designed as friar faces. The switches themselves were positioned at the noses. To turn on lights, you had to pick the friar's nose. Visitors who discovered this detail invariably laughed. It was so unexpected, so undignified, so perfectly in character for a man who filled his estate with puns and visual jokes. The east facade, the garden front, rises 3 stories beneath the attic. Rectangular red roof tiles cover the top. Red brick and light masonry construction includes carvings with mysterious mottos, peculiar puzzles, and enigmatic inscriptions scattered across the surface. Along the ground floor, windows of the original dining room, library, study, and large drawing rooms face the landscapes. On the northern section, the east front drops to 2 stories, with a flat roof surrounded by railing enclosing a large tiled porch. The most striking feature is the square tower rising 4 stories from the ground to a pyramidal roof. An attic above contains narrow windows within the pyramidal shape, capped with a copper finial. A round corner turret with pyramidal roof occupies the left side. An octagonal corner turret with indentations reminiscent of battlements sits on the right. The building was designed to be viewed from the plantings. The east front was where Frank spent his time, looking out over the descending landscape he was creating. This was the facade that needed to impress. The south entrance was merely functional. The east front was theatrical. Along the terrace below runs a Dutch-style open knot garden with formal beds arranged in scroll forms. The outer beds measure roughly 12 feet wide by 40 feet long, planted with dwarf shrubs. During Frank's era, Victorian gardeners typically planted violas in winter, hardy plants that could survive frost. In summer, they'd switch to bedding plants like begonias and geraniums that provided color through the warmer months. The beds would be completely replanted twice annually. At the end of the terrace path stands a fountain referred to as Ye Fountain of Perpetual Mirth, The base measures roughly 20 feet in length. Frank surrounded it with 4 mermaids dressed as nuns. Above them, 4 dolphins with friar heads. The combination of maritime mythology and religious imagery was typical of his approach, mixing elements that traditionally didn't belong together, creating something unexpected. The basin contained water lilies of various colors and goldfish. The fountain provided both visual beauty and sound, the splash of water adding to the sensory experience of the surroundings. When George Harrison purchased the property in 1970, he placed a Hindu statue in the fountain's center. He also arranged colorful German gnomes around its perimeter, the same gnomes that would appear on the cover of his album All Things Must Pass. The residence was completed in 1895. By Victorian standards, it was substantial but not enormous. Grander country houses existed, but few matched Friar Park's exuberance of detail. Every surface carried carving or ornament. Every feature served aesthetic as well as functional purposes. The structure cost a fortune to build. Exact figures aren't recorded, but the red brick, imported materials, custom terracotta, elaborate woodwork, stained glass, and complex roof lines all required significant expense. The 3 gatehouses alone would have cost what typical Victorian families earned in lifetimes. But the main building and its supporting structures were merely the architectural framework. The real project, the Museum of Gardens, was just beginning. Frank would spend the next 2 decades filling 30 acres with botanical collections, themed plantings, water features, caves, and countless surprises. The mansion provided a base, a place to live and host guests. But the landscapes were his true passion. When visitors arrived at Friar Park after 1895, they found a completed Gothic fantasy residence. But the estate was far from finished. The Alpine Rock Garden hadn't been built. The underground caves hadn't been excavated. The Japanese garden didn't exist. Most of the themed plantings were still in planning stages. The structure was ready. Now the real work would begin, creating the landscapes that would make Friar Park famous throughout the horticultural world. Chapter 4. The Alpine Garden and Matterhorn. In 1896, Frank began his most ambitious landscaping project. The Alpine Rock Garden at Friar Park would become the largest in England. Built on approximately 3 acres on the northwest slope of the property, it would rise nearly 40 feet from base to summit. At its peak would stand a replica of the Matterhorn, the iconic mountain on the Swiss-Italian border. The concept was audacious. Henley-on-Thames sits in the Thames Valley. The terrain is gentle, rolling hills at most. There are no mountains, no dramatic elevations, no true alpine conditions. He would create them artificially. The project required moving massive quantities of material. Sources suggest 7,000 tons of limestone were transported from Yorkshire. The material came by rail to Henley Station, then by horse and cart to the site. Each piece was individually placed to create naturalistic-looking formations. Additional material came from other quarries, real boulders, artificial rocks made from pullumite, a substance invented and patented by James Pullum in the mid-1800s. Pullumite could be molded to look like weathered natural formations. It was lighter than actual rock and could be shaped to fit specific spaces. The combination of genuine Yorkshire limestone and artificial pullumite created a landscape that appeared entirely natural. Visitors couldn't easily distinguish which elements were real and which were manufactured. That ambiguity was part of the design. The rockery wasn't simply piled material, it was carefully engineered. Proper drainage was essential. Alpines require excellent drainage. They evolved in mountain environments where water moves quickly through rocky soil. Standing water kills them. Milner and the team of gardeners created pockets and crevices throughout the structure. Each pocket was filled with appropriate soil mixture. Different areas received different compositions based on what would be planted there. The scale allowed for dramatic variations in microclimate. North-facing sections remained cooler and shadier. South-facing areas received full sun and warmth. Sheltered pockets stayed moist. Exposed ridges dried quickly. This variety meant Frank could grow an extraordinary range of species in a single location. The plantings were extensive. Contemporary accounts suggest the rockery contained 4,000 different varieties. This wasn't a small collection. This was one of the most comprehensive displays in the world. He acquired specimens from across Europe and Asia, flora from Switzerland, Austria, and the French Alps, species from the Himalayas, specimens from mountain regions of Japan and China, rare varieties from botanical collectors who specialized in high-elevation flora. The specimens were arranged in broad masses among the formations, hundreds or thousands of a single type planted together. The effect during blooming periods was spectacular. Sheets of color cascading down the formations. Many featured glazed green leaves that remained attractive throughout the year. The display provided visual interest even in winter when most weren't flowering. Evergreen varieties, interesting rock formations, and the structure itself maintained appeal across all seasons. Paths wound through the rockery. Visitors could climb gradually from bottom to top, experiencing different communities at each elevation. The walk took substantial time if you stopped to examine specimens. Frank wanted people to spend time here, to appreciate the variety, to understand the careful placement of each specimen. At the summit stood the Matterhorn replica. The original Matterhorn rises 14,692 feet above sea level. This version stood approximately 20 feet high, roughly 1/1/700th scale. Small compared to the real mountain, monumental compared to everything around it in Henley. The replica was built of sandstone carefully shaped to match the distinctive pyramidal form of the actual peak. The Matterhorn's silhouette is instantly recognizable. Sharp ridges, steep faces, that characteristic point at the summit. This version captured those proportions. Seen from the bottom, looking up through the vegetation and formations, the replica created a surprisingly convincing illusion of distance and scale. The peak was topped with pulverized quartz to simulate snow. From certain angles, especially in bright sunlight, the white cap gleamed just like snow-covered summits. But Frank couldn't resist adding humor. Near the summit, he placed miniature chamois, the goat antelopes native to European mountains. They were made of tin. Tiny metal animals positioned on the crags as if they were real chamois climbing the slopes. At the bottom, he installed a telescope. Visitors could look through it and see the chamois on the rocks. From that distance and perspective, with the forced perspective of the scaled mountain, the tin animals appeared to be the proper size of real chamois viewed from far away in Switzerland. It was an optical trick, a joke, a demonstration of how perception could be manipulated, entirely in character for someone who filled his entire estate with visual puzzles and illusions. The telescope became a popular feature. Guests would take turns looking through it, discovering the chamois, laughing at the cleverness of the deception. At the base of the man-made mountain, Frank installed a miniature Swiss chalet. Visitors could sit there and enjoy the view upward, taking in the entire display from below. The chalet provided context. It reinforced the Swiss mountain theme. A waterfall descended to a pool at the bottom. The water was filled with fragrant lilies floating on the sparkling surface. The sound of falling water added to the sensory experience. The entire project represented years of work. Construction began in 1896. Planting continued for years afterward as new specimens were acquired and established. Maintenance required constant attention from specialized staff who understood requirements. Contemporary horticultural publications praised the achievement. Country Life magazine published extensive articles with photographs. Gardening journals described it as one of the most remarkable in the country. Visitors came specifically to see the rockery. The project cost a fortune. Moving 7,000 tons of material, building the structures, acquiring 4,000 varieties, employing gardeners with specialized knowledge. The expense was extraordinary even by Victorian standards. But Frank considered it worthwhile. This wasn't merely decorative landscaping. This was botanical education. A living collection where visitors could see specimens they'd never encounter otherwise. A demonstration of what could be achieved with sufficient resources and imagination. The rockery also served as his laboratory. He experimented with cultivation techniques, tested which species would thrive in English conditions, shared knowledge with other members of the Royal Horticultural Society and the Linnaean Society. He was particularly interested in understanding how alpines adapted to lowland environments. Most evolved in harsh mountain conditions: intense sunlight, cold temperatures, short growing seasons, strong winds. How would they respond to the Thames Valley's mild, moist climate? Some thrived, others required careful management. A few proved impossible to maintain long term. The rockery became a valuable research site for British horticulturists interested in cultivation at lower elevations. Frank created a detailed guidebook specifically for this feature. It explained the layout, identified key species, described the construction techniques, and provided historical context. Visitors could follow the guide as they explored, learning as they went. The guidebook revealed his teaching instincts. He wanted people to understand, not just admire. He wanted them to leave knowing more than when they arrived. The display remained Friar Park's most spectacular feature throughout Frank's lifetime. It was what the estate became famous for. Horticultural enthusiasts traveled specifically to see it. Photographs appeared in publications worldwide. When Frank died in 1919, the rockery was at its peak. Mature plantings, well-established collections, everything functioning as designed. Over subsequent decades, maintenance became irregular. The nuns who occupied the property from the 1950s onward didn't have resources or expertise to properly care for such a specialized feature. Vegetation died, weeds invaded, structures deteriorated. By 1970, when George Harrison purchased Friar Park, the area was severely overgrown. Trees had seeded themselves among the formations. Invasive species had taken over. The careful planting schemes were lost under vegetation. Harrison undertook restoration. He brought in goats to clear undergrowth on the steep slopes. He employed gardeners to remove unwanted growth. He worked to reveal the original structures. His wife Olivia continued the effort after his death in 2001. She researched historical photographs and documents to understand what Frank had originally planted. She worked with horticultural specialists to reestablish appropriate species. The restoration has been remarkable. Today, the display is again a spectacular feature. The Matterhorn replica still stands. The formations are cleared and properly maintained. The work shows the enduring power of Frank's vision. More than a century after construction, the basic structure he created still functions. The careful engineering, drainage, placement, microclimate variety still works. Modern visitors can experience something close to what Victorian guests saw. The scale, the variety, the dramatic topography, the whimsy of the Matterhorn and telescope, the integration of natural and artificial elements. The achievement at Friar Park remains one of the most extraordinary examples of Victorian landscape engineering in England, a testament to one man's determination to create an environment where none naturally existed, to bring Swiss mountains to the Thames Valley through sheer force of imagination and wealth. Frank's museum contained many remarkable features. But the rockery, with its 7,000 tons of Yorkshire limestone, 4,000 varieties, and 20-foot Matterhorn, was perhaps his greatest achievement. It proved that with sufficient resources, expertise, and vision, a Victorian gentleman could literally move mountains. Chapter 5. The Underground Caves and Grottos. Beneath Friar Park's surface lay a hidden world. Frank created an extensive system of artificial caves and underground passages. Some could be accessed by boat from the lake. Others had entrances within the rockery. A staircase from the northeast side of the main house led directly underground. This wasn't a single cave. This was a complex network. Multiple chambers connected by passages, each designed with different themes and purposes. Visitors could spend substantial time exploring the underground spaces, moving from one surprising environment to another. The system served multiple functions: entertainment for guests, botanical experimentation in controlled environments, demonstration of Victorian engineering capabilities, and, inevitably, another opportunity for Frank's sense of humor to manifest in unexpected ways. The most dramatic entrance was from the lake. Visitors rowing on the water would notice a low, narrow opening that appeared to be made of rough, natural formations. The entrance was deliberately unassuming. Nothing indicated what lay beyond. Those who dared to row inside found themselves in a devilishly darkened and confining space. The boat barely fit. The ceiling hung low overhead, the walls pressed close on both sides. This was intentional discomfort. Frank wanted visitors slightly unsettled, uncertain, questioning whether they should continue or turn back. But curiosity usually won. Boats proceeded inch by inch, foot by foot, deeper into the passage. The darkness was nearly complete. The sound of water against the boat echoed off stone walls. Then the passage widened. Light appeared, pale blue illumination that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. This was Frank's recreation of the Blue Grotto on the island of Capri off southern Italy. The famous sea cave where sunlight passing through underwater openings creates an ethereal blue glow throughout the interior. At Friar Park, the effect was achieved artificially. Electric lights hidden behind translucent materials created the blue luminescence. But the visual impact was similar, an otherworldly quality that transformed ordinary underground space into something magical. The sound of water could be heard tinkling down formations in the shadows. The passage continued on, leading deeper into the cave system. Visitors could disembark at certain points and continue on foot through passages that branched in different directions. Each section had its own character, its own surprises. One chamber was known as the Vine Cave. The ceiling and walls were covered with artificial vines bearing berries made of glass. Inside each glass berry was an electric light. When illuminated, the entire chamber glowed with hundreds of luminous fruits. This was remarkable Victorian technology. Electric lighting was still relatively new in the 1890s. Most homes used gas or oil lamps. Frank was installing sophisticated electrical systems underground for purely decorative purposes. The Vine Cave created an impossible environment. Fruit that glowed. Plants growing without sunlight. Nature enhanced and transformed by technology. Visitors understood they were seeing something artificial, but the effect was still captivating. Another section was the Wishing Well Cave. This chamber specialized in optical illusions. Mirrors placed at angles created confusing perspectives. Surfaces that appeared solid were reflective. Depths were impossible to judge accurately. Frank loved manipulating perception. Throughout Friar Park, the stepping stones on the lake, the chamois on the Matterhorn, the "Don't Keep Off the Grass" sign, he constantly challenged visitors' assumptions about what they were seeing. The Wishing Well Cave continued that theme underground. Further passages led to chambers built up to 12 feet high and 15 feet wide. These provided relief from the constricting tunnels. But relief was temporary. One large chamber contained what appeared to be human skeletons arranged in various positions. Whether they were real human remains or Victorian anatomical models was deliberately ambiguous. Frank never clarified. The uncertainty added to the unsettling atmosphere. Victorian sensibilities around death and human remains were different from modern attitudes. Displaying skeletons wasn't necessarily macabre. It could be educational or even entertaining in certain contexts. But it was unusual, unexpected. Another example of Frank creating spaces that confused and surprised. The skeleton chamber led to perhaps the most famous section of the underground system, the Gnome Cave. Frank was an enthusiastic collector of German garden gnomes. He reportedly had the second largest collection in all of England. While gnomes appeared throughout the surface grounds, the underground chamber housed a substantial portion of his collection. The gnomes were arranged in various scenes and tableaux. Some appeared to be working, others seemed to be celebrating. Groups were positioned as if engaged in activities. The arrangements changed periodically as Frank rearranged his collection. The cave also contained distorting mirrors in recesses along the walls. When visitors looked into these mirrors, they appeared transformed. Heights changed, proportions shifted. People saw themselves as short, squat figures, essentially as gnomes themselves. This was Frank's joke. You came to see the gnomes. The gnomes turned out to be you. The gnome collection was scattered and lost over the decades after Frank's death. But when George Harrison purchased Friar Park in 1970, he made efforts to track down the original gnomes. He managed to recover many of them and return them to the property. 4 of these gnomes appeared in the famous photograph used for the cover of Harrison's album All Things Must Pass. Harrison sat on the lawn surrounded by the gnomes, a direct connection to Frank's Victorian collection and his sense of whimsy. Higher up in the system, accessible from the rockery, was the Ice Grotto. Frank modeled this after the Ice Grotto at Grindelwald in Switzerland. Visitors entered through a wooden door to find an interior filled with artificial ice formations. Stalactites hung from the ceiling. Stalagmites rose from the floor. Cavities appeared filled with blue-tinted ice. Water from an artificial glacier entered through a waterfall. In winter, the cold created real icicles naturally. During warmer months, refrigeration equipment maintained frozen conditions artificially. This represented cutting-edge Victorian engineering. Creating and maintaining ice formations inside a cave during English summers required sophisticated refrigeration systems. The technology existed. Mechanical refrigeration had been developed earlier in the century, but installing it underground for aesthetic purposes was extravagant. Hidden electric lights illuminated the grotto in pale blue. The color enhanced the icy atmosphere. Combined with the actual cold temperatures, the effect was dramatic. Visitors stepped from warm sunshine into a Swiss ice cave within seconds. The temperature drop was immediate and substantial. People who entered in summer clothing found themselves shivering within minutes. The grotto couldn't be lingered in comfortably without proper attire, but that was part of the experience, the shock of sudden environmental change. Throughout the cave system, Frank installed various other features. Additional passages led to dead ends, or looped back to earlier sections. Some chambers contained benches where visitors could rest. Others held specimens of minerals or geological formations that Frank had collected. The walls throughout featured inscriptions, Latin phrases, English mottos, puzzles, and riddles. Frank's practice of embedding text into his architecture continued underground. Even in darkness, surrounded by artificial caves and optical illusions, visitors encountered his voice through carved words. The engineering required to create this system was substantial. The passages had to be properly supported to prevent collapse. Drainage had to function correctly. Underground spaces in the Thames Valley naturally accumulate water. Ventilation was necessary to prevent stale air or dangerous gas buildup. The electrical installations were complex. Running power underground in the 1890s required careful insulation and protection from moisture. The systems had to be maintained regularly. Frank employed staff specifically responsible for the underground features. The caves also required ongoing cleaning and maintenance. Artificial formations could deteriorate. Electric bulbs needed replacement. The refrigeration equipment for the ice grotto required constant monitoring and repair. Standing water had to be pumped out. Humidity levels needed control to prevent mold. Frank's commitment to maintaining these spaces demonstrated their importance to his overall vision. The caves weren't an afterthought. They were integral to the Friar Park experience. The estate offered both surface spectacle and hidden underground wonders. Contemporary visitors wrote about the caves with fascination. Letters and diaries from people who toured Friar Park frequently mentioned the underground passages as highlights. The combination of natural-seeming formations, modern technology, and theatrical lighting created memorable experiences. The caves also served practical functions beyond entertainment. The controlled underground environment allowed Frank to experiment with plants that required specific conditions. Some chambers maintained consistent cool temperatures ideal for certain species. Others could be kept humid or dry as needed. The ice grotto particularly interested him from a botanical perspective. Could any plants survive in those conditions? What adaptations would be necessary? The space became a laboratory for understanding extreme environment cultivation. After Frank's death in 1919, maintenance of the cave system became irregular. The electrical systems were expensive to operate. The refrigeration for the ice grotto eventually stopped working. Water damage affected some passages. Entrances became blocked or overgrown. By the time the nuns occupied the property in the 1950s, much of the underground system was inaccessible or unsafe. Passages flooded, Electrical hazards developed. The decorative elements deteriorated. The caves were essentially abandoned. When George Harrison purchased Friar Park in 1970, the underground system was in poor condition. Some areas were still accessible, but many passages were blocked or dangerous. The Blue Grotto effect no longer functioned. The Vine Cave's glass barriers were broken or missing. The Ice Grotto was simply a damp cave without refrigeration. Harrison undertook selective restoration. He ensured the basic structures were safe. He cleared some passages. But he didn't attempt to fully recreate Frank's elaborate systems. The electrical installations alone would have cost a fortune to replicate with modern safety standards. Some elements remain. The basic cave structures exist. The passages can be navigated by those who know them. The spaces retain their Victorian engineering even without all the decorative enhancements. Olivia Harrison has continued careful preservation. The caves are maintained safely. Historic features are protected. But full restoration to Frank's original vision remains impractical, given the complexity and cost of recreating Victorian electrical and mechanical systems underground. The cave system at Friar Park represents Victorian ambition at its most extravagant, creating an entire underground world for entertainment and botanical experimentation. Installing electricity and refrigeration in spaces carved beneath an English estate, filling artificial caves with art, illusions, and jokes. Most Victorian estates had wine cellars, root cellars, perhaps ice houses for food storage. Frank created an underground theme park with multiple environments and theatrical effects. The caves demonstrated what could be achieved with sufficient wealth, Victorian engineering, and complete disregard for practicality. They served no essential function. They were expensive to create and maintain. They existed purely because Frank wanted them to exist. That extravagance, that willingness to spend extraordinary sums creating spaces that existed only for delight and surprise, defined much of what Frank built at Friar Park. The caves were perhaps the purest expression of that philosophy. Above ground, features served some practical purposes. The rockery was genuinely valuable for botanical research. The themed plantings demonstrated historical accuracy. The house provided residence. Underground, there was no pretense of practicality. These were fantasy spaces, environments designed purely to astonish, confuse, and entertain. Frank's underground world survived more than a century. The passages still exist beneath the Oxfordshire countryside. The chambers still echo with water sounds. The spaces still hold Victorian engineering secrets, and somewhere in that darkness, glass berries still hang from artificial vines, waiting to glow again. Chapter 6. The Lakes and Water Features. From the east-facing terraces of the main house, visitors looked down upon what appeared to be a single large expanse. The view was deceptive. What looked like one body appeared actually as 3 separate pools arranged in tiers. The optical illusion was deliberate. Another example of Frank manipulating perception to create effects that weren't immediately obvious. The aquatic system at Friar Park served multiple purposes: aesthetic beauty, botanical habitat for aquatic species, practical irrigation for the extensive plantings, and, inevitably, opportunities for jokes and surprises. The arrangement evolved and expanded throughout Frank's time at the property. Early plans showed modest features. By the early 1900s, the system had grown into something far more elaborate. The 3 pools were built at different elevations. The highest sat at the western end. Flow cascaded from there down to the middle tier, then descended to the lowest pool at the eastern edge. The effect created a terraced waterfall system that appeared natural despite being entirely artificial. From a distance, particularly from the house looking down, the different levels weren't immediately apparent. The pools appeared to merge into one continuous body, roughly 150 feet wide and nearly 300 feet long. This illusion allowed Frank to create his most famous trick. At surface level on the upper tier, he placed a series of stepping stones. Large, flat surfaces positioned just at the waterline. From far away, from the house terraces or the opposite bank, people walking on these appeared to be walking on the surface itself. The effect was startling. Visitors who didn't know the secret watched in confusion as people seemingly defied physics, strolling across without sinking. On the next tier down, additional stepping stones were positioned slightly below the surface. People walking on these appeared to be wading through, but they emerged on the other side completely dry. Their feet were wet, perhaps, but they hadn't actually walked through deep areas. Again, the illusion depended on viewing angle and distance. From certain positions, the deception was obvious. You could see the supports beneath. From other angles, particularly from the house, the trick was convincing. Frank loved showing this to guests. He'd position visitors at the optimal viewing spot, then send someone walking across. The reactions were predictable: confusion, delight, demands to know how it was done. When George Harrison made promotional films at Friar Park, he used these for dramatic effect. His 1976 video for Crackerbox Palace featured people appearing to walk through. The Victorian illusion translated perfectly to film. The supports themselves were made from pulhamite, the same artificial material used in the rockery. They could be shaped precisely to the required dimensions and positioned exactly where needed. Real natural materials would have been difficult to find in the specific sizes and flatness required. The entire arrangement was artificial. Everything was man-made. The pools were excavated, the waterfalls were built, the connections between tiers were engineered. The edges were carefully landscaped with formations that appeared natural. But these too were constructed from pulhamite arranged to look like weathered bedrock. The goal was creating an environment that seemed to have existed naturally for centuries. Surrounding the aquatic areas, Frank planted extensive collections of trees: blue spruce, California pines, weeping willows. The trees served practical functions, providing shade, stabilizing banks, blocking wind. But they also enhanced the aesthetic. The reflections in still surfaces created the picturesque quality that Victorian landscape design prized. At the far end, Frank built a recreation of the sacred bridge of Nikko. This famous Japanese bridge crosses the Daya River at the entrance to the Nikko shrines in Japan. It's known for its distinctive curved form and red lacquer finish. His version replicated those characteristics. The bridge connected one inlet to another, spanning a narrow section. The curved profile and bright coloring made it a focal point visible from multiple vantage points throughout the property. The bridge served practical purposes, allowing passage across without boats, but its primary function was decorative and thematic. It connected to Frank's larger interest in Japanese design that manifested more fully in the dedicated Japanese garden elsewhere on the grounds. The arrangement included various inlets and coves. Some were planted with aquatic species: lilies, irises, semi-aquatic ferns. Others were kept clear for rowing. The varied depths and profiles created different habitats for different purposes. A bog garden was created near the southern edge closest to the entrance drive. This specialized environment supported plants that thrived in consistently moist, acidic soil: irises, native ferns, species that naturally occurred in wetlands. The bog provided botanical diversity and demonstrated Frank's comprehensive approach to creating varied growing conditions. Throughout the pools, he maintained fish populations, goldfish primarily. They added movement and color. They also helped control mosquito larvae and other aquatic insects. The fish were large enough to be visible from the banks, orange and red shapes moving beneath the surface. The aquatic arrangement connected to the underground cave network. The entrance to the Blue Grotto opened from the edge. Boats could be rowed directly from the open areas into the cave passages. The connection between surface and underground environments was seamless. Additional tunnels connected the three pools below the surface. These passages were large enough to row through. Visitors could take boats from one tier to another without returning to shore. The journey through the tunnels, moving from sunlight into darkness, then emerging into light again in a different pool, was another theatrical experience. The tunnels were built large enough that boats could pass comfortably, but confined enough to feel dramatic. The echo of oars reverberated off stone walls. The darkness was nearly complete, except for the circles of light visible at either end. These passages required significant engineering. They had to be waterproofed, structurally sound. properly graded so flow moved in the intended direction. The construction was invisible to casual observers, but essential to the functioning. Boats were kept available for visitors. Small rowing craft, nothing elaborate, simple vessels that could hold 2 or 3 people, enough boats that multiple parties could be on the surface simultaneously without crowding. Rowing the circuit became a standard activity for guests. The journey could take an hour or more if you explored the full arrangement. Into the tunnels, through the Blue Grotto entrance, around the various inlets, under the Nico Bridge. The experience combined gentle exercise with constantly changing scenery. The sound of the waterfalls was ever present. The cascades between tiers created a continuous background of flowing sound. The volume changed with rainfall, louder after storms, quieter during dry periods. But some sound was always there. Frank positioned benches at various spots along the banks, places where visitors could sit and observe, watch the fish, listen to the falls, enjoy the reflections. The aquatic areas were designed for lingering, not just passing through. The arrangement also served practical irrigation functions. Pumps moved liquid to various parts of the property where it supplied the extensive plantings. The pools essentially functioned as a reservoir feeding the broader landscape maintenance. The pumping equipment was steam-powered initially. Later, electric pumps were installed. The machinery was housed in dedicated buildings away from public view. Visitors experienced the aesthetic results, flowing cascades, healthy plantings, without seeing the infrastructure that made it possible. Maintaining the arrangement required constant attention. Levels needed monitoring. The waterfalls required periodic cleaning of debris. The Pulamite formations needed repairs when damaged. Fish populations had to be managed. Aquatic plantings required seasonal care. Frank employed staff specifically responsible for these features. People who understood hydrology, aquatic botany, and mechanical operations. The pools weren't something that could simply be built and then ignored. During winter, the surface partially froze. It would ice over in cold snaps. Frank occasionally allowed skating when conditions were safe. The frozen expanse provided different recreational opportunities and changed the property's visual character during cold months. In spring, the ice melted. Aquatic plants began growing again. Fish became active. The pools transitioned from frozen stillness to living ecosystem. The seasonal changes were part of the landscape's appeal. Contemporary photographs show the arrangement at various seasons and from different angles. The images reveal how it appeared from the house terraces, from the banks, from various garden paths. Each viewpoint offered different perspectives on the illusions Frank had created. After his death, maintenance became irregular. The pumps weren't always operated. The waterfalls sometimes clogged with debris. The fish populations fluctuated. The stepping stones became overgrown with algae. By the time George Harrison purchased the property, the arrangement was functional but neglected. The basic structures remained sound: the excavated pools, the connections between tiers, the tunnels. But the decorative elements had deteriorated. Harrison undertook restoration. He cleared vegetation, repaired the waterfalls, re-established proper flow, cleaned the stepping stones so the illusions worked again, rebuilt sections of Pulamite edging that had crumbled. He also added his own touches. The Hindu statue placed in the fountain on the terrace, additional plantings around the banks, modifications to make the space work for his needs while respecting Frank's original design. The aquatic features remain central to Friar Park today. The 3-tiered arrangement still functions. The waterfalls still cascade. The stepping stones still create their optical illusions. The Nico Bridge still spans the inlet. Olivia Harrison has continued maintaining and enhancing these elements. The arrangement requires ongoing care, managing levels, controlling aquatic vegetation, repairing damage from weather and time. The pools demonstrate Frank's commitment to creating multifunctional landscape elements. They served aesthetic purposes, creating beauty, reflections, focal points. They provided recreation, rowing, walking the banks, sitting in contemplation. They enabled botanical collections of aquatic species. They supplied irrigation for the broader property. Most impressively, They created opportunities for illusion and surprise. The walking on surface effect, the hidden connections between pools, the seamless transition from surface to underground environments. Like so much at Friar Park, the aquatic arrangement was never just one thing. It was beautiful, practical, surprising, educational, humorous, all simultaneously. A century after construction, the flow still descends the 3 tiers, still reflects the surrounding trees and sky, still invites visitors to take boats and explore, still demonstrates that at Friar Park, nothing is quite as simple as it first appears. The pools remain what Frank intended, a place where Victorian engineering created the illusion of natural beauty, where carefully constructed features appeared effortless, and where the boundary between real and artificial was deliberately blurred. On still days, when the surface is smooth, visitors can see their reflections looking back. And perhaps, if they look carefully enough, they might glimpse Frank himself, still present in every deliberately placed stone, every calculated sightline, every perfectly engineered optical trick. Chapter 7. The Museum of Gardens. Frank called Friar Park his museum. The name was deliberate. Museums collect and display. They educate. They preserve examples for study. That's exactly what he intended. The property contained not one style, but many. Medieval, Elizabethan, Japanese, herb collections, rose displays, topiary arrangements. Each represented a different period, culture, or horticultural approach. Each was researched for historical accuracy and botanical authenticity. This wasn't typical Victorian landscaping. Most estates had fashionable grounds reflecting current taste. He created historical reproductions. He wanted visitors to experience how landscapes appeared in different eras and places, to understand the evolution of design through direct observation. The project required extraordinary research. He studied medieval manuscripts, examined 16th century books, consulted contemporary sources on Japanese design. He didn't merely create attractive arrangements. He recreated specific historical examples with scholarly precision. Henry Ernest Milner provided the overall landscape framework, but the detailed planning of individual themed sections came from Frank's research and botanical knowledge. Milner ensured proper placement and practical function. Frank ensured historical accuracy. The medieval sections were copied from pictures illustrated in the 15th century. He acquired reproductions of manuscript illuminations showing layouts from that period. These images provided templates. Medieval landscapes had distinctive characteristics: raised beds faced with brick or wood, troughs and trellises, fences and palisades, fountains and wells, arbors and pavilions, railed enclosures with chessboard arrangements of beds. He recreated these features at Friar Park. The beds were raised above ground level with wooden board sides, exactly as illustrations showed. The railed sections divided spaces into geometric patterns. The selections emphasized medicinal and practical species over ornamental beauty. Medieval cultivation served functional purposes: herbs for medicine and cooking, vegetables for sustenance. Flowers were secondary. He maintained this distinction. One section contained 34 medicinal herbs. Another held 34 medicinal flowers, grown not for beauty, but for pharmaceutical properties. This reflected medieval priorities accurately. The Elizabethan section was laid out from sources in a 16th century book called The Gardener's Labyrinth. This text, published in 1577, provided detailed instructions for design during that era. Elizabethan landscapes differed from medieval predecessors. More elaborate geometric patterns, greater emphasis on ornamental selections, introduction of new species from exploration and trade, but still maintaining practical focus alongside aesthetics. His Elizabethan area followed the historical model: beds arranged in intricate patterns, paths dividing spaces into formal compartments, selections that would have been available in 16th century England, no species introduced later. The attention to period accuracy extended to construction materials and techniques. If historical sources showed wooden trellises, he used wood, not metal. If illustrations depicted brick edges, he used brick, not stone. Every detail matched the historical record. The Japanese section represented his most ambitious cultural reproduction. He didn't create a generic Oriental space. He replicated a specific design from a specific source. The model came from Josiah Conder's 1893 masterpiece, Landscape Gardening in Japan. Conder was a British architect who lived in Japan and became known as the father of modern Japanese architecture. His book was the authoritative Western source on Japanese design. One illustration in Conder's book showed a landscape with 5 hills arranged in particular relationships. Frank recreated that exact design at Friar Park. Not an interpretation. An exact replication. As he explained in his visitor's guide, Japanese landscapes are not flower displays. Western visitors expected colorful blooms. Japanese aesthetics emphasized different qualities: stone placement, water features, subtle textures, seasonal changes in foliage. The gardener selected species one would find in actual Japanese environments. 7 trees had specific symbolic meanings and importance to the design. Their placement wasn't arbitrary, but followed Japanese principles of balance and harmony. Stones were specifically chosen and positioned throughout. In Japanese design, rock placement tells visual stories and creates harmony. The gardeners arranged the formations according to traditional principles. The area included all essential Japanese elements: a waterfall and basin, a wall and gate, plank and boarded bridges, a tea house and shrine, numerous Japanese lanterns. These weren't decorative additions. They were integral components positioned according to Japanese design philosophy. The tea house was functional, not merely ornamental. Visitors could enter and experience the space as it would be used in Japan. The shrine was similarly authentic, not a British fancy, but a proper Japanese structure. The space appeared as if lifted from Japanese landscape and transplanted to Henley. The effect was remarkably convincing. People familiar with actual Japanese environments recognized the authenticity immediately. He hired people with specialized knowledge to maintain the Japanese section. Growing and pruning techniques differed from English practices. The aesthetic goals were different. Staff needed to understand Japanese principles to care for the space properly. The herb collections were divided by paths and arranged in specialized groupings. One section contained culinary herbs, varieties used in cooking. Another held medicinal types, species with pharmaceutical applications. A third featured fragrant herbs grown for scent rather than practical use. The arrangements weren't simply attractive displays. They were organized botanical collections. Each herb was labeled. Visitors could learn identification, uses, and cultivation requirements. The section served educational purposes. He grew peas, asparagus, lettuce, and leafy vegetables in the kitchen area. Radishes, celery, scallions, leeks, and carrots occupied other beds. Broccoli, potatoes, onions, cauliflower, and string beans had dedicated spaces. The kitchen section wasn't for show. It produced food for the household. Victorian estates were expected to be partially self-sufficient. But his version was larger and more systematically organized than typical. He applied the same thorough approach to practical vegetable cultivation as to ornamental displays. The rose collection occupied the northern portion of the property. Pillars and pergolas were arranged along paths. The central pathway was bowered over with branching growths and clusterings of flowers, including the bright red crimson rambler. He grew Dorothy Perkins roses, introduced in 1901 as one of the earliest roses named after a specific person. By selecting recently developed cultivars alongside established varieties, he demonstrated the evolution of rose breeding. The rose area served contemplative purposes. Victorian culture associated roses with romance and refinement. A well-designed rose display provided spaces for walking, sitting, and quiet conversation. The solemn silence surrounded by spectacular blooms created an atmosphere unlike other sections of the property. Frank had one of the largest collections of sundials in England. Some dated back to the mid-1600s. He placed them throughout what he called the dial display. At the time of construction, topiary was out of favor in Victorian England. The elaborate-shaped evergreens popular in earlier eras seemed old-fashioned. But he didn't follow fashion. He created an astonishing topiary arrangement anyway. The layout replicated the Labyrinth of Versailles, the famous maze at Louis XIV's palace that was destroyed in 1775. He used historical records to reconstruct the path configuration, then filled it with trees clipped in endless variety. Tea tables, peacocks, presentation cups, columns, pyramids, ovals. The shapes required constant maintenance by skilled staff who understood pruning techniques. Topiary demands precise, regular trimming to maintain forms. The sundials were positioned throughout the topiary paths. Visitors wandered the maze, consulting timepieces that measured hours by shadow rather than mechanical movement. The combination of shaped evergreens and antique sundials created a distinctly 17th century atmosphere. A rhododendron collection was established on a bank. The paths were designed in swirls and whirls that wound toward the center. Big, bold, beautiful blossoms emerged in spring and summer. The mass selections created dramatic color displays when in bloom. 2 areas had beds arranged in chessboard fashion, surrounded either by low trellis work or by boards or bricks. One contained exclusively specimens with gray and silver tones: Japanese painted fern, silver shimmers, lungwort, dusty miller, licorice varieties, woolly lamb's ear. The other chessboard space featured only specimens with blue tones: sky blue hydrangea, hyssop flowers, blue star-shaped blossoms of borage. The monochromatic color schemes were unusual for the era. Most favored variety and contrast. His approach demonstrated botanical principles, showing how coordinated selections created unified effects. Behind the gardener's lodge, a walled enclosure grew trees and bushes that produced berries throughout the seasons. This provided fruit for the household while demonstrating succession cultivation, choosing varieties that ripened at different times to extend harvest. Throughout all these diverse sections, he maintained consistent standards, historical accuracy where applicable, botanical precision everywhere, educational value for visitors, and underlying everything, evidence of his personality, jokes, surprises, unexpected combinations. To maintain this complexity, Frank employed 45 full-time gardeners. This wasn't excessive given the scale and specialization required. Different sections needed different expertise. Japanese maintenance differed from rose care. Medieval herb cultivation followed different principles than Elizabethan ornamental work. Philip Knowles supervised the staff as head gardener and estate manager. He coordinated the various specialists, ensured consistent standards across diverse areas, managed seasonal work and crop rotations, allocated resources and prioritized maintenance tasks. The operation was substantial. Seed orders, specimen acquisitions from nurseries and collectors worldwide, tool maintenance, greenhouse management, compost production, pest control using Victorian methods, record keeping for thousands of individual specimens. Frank created detailed guidebooks explaining the various sections. He wanted visitors to understand what they were seeing, to recognize the historical references, to appreciate the research and effort behind each area. The guides included lists, historical background, cultivation notes, and explanations of design principles. They were scholarly documents, not simple tourist pamphlets. His teaching instincts pervaded the educational materials just as they shaped the physical spaces. Contemporary horticultural publications praised the diversity and quality. Visitors traveled specifically to study particular sections. The Japanese area attracted people interested in Eastern design. The medieval sections drew historians. Rose enthusiasts came for that collection. Topiary specialists examined the shaped evergreens. The property functioned as intended, a museum where living collections demonstrated history. Not simply beautiful grounds, but educational displays with scholarly foundations. After his death in 1919, maintaining the full scope became increasingly difficult. The specialized knowledge required wasn't easily preserved. Staff who understood Japanese principles left or retired. Expertise in medieval schemes was lost. The topiary shapes grew wild without proper trimming. By the time the nuns occupied the property in the 1950s, most themed sections had disappeared or become unrecognizable. The basic landscape remained. Trees and paths existed, but the carefully organized historical reproductions were largely gone. When George Harrison purchased Friar Park in 1970, he faced acres of overgrown grounds. The underlying structure was there, the paths Milner laid out, the basic geography created. But the detailed arrangements and themed sections were lost. Harrison focused restoration efforts on features that could be recovered: the rockery, the aquatic arrangements, the main terraces. He didn't attempt to recreate the medieval or Elizabethan sections. The specialized knowledge required wasn't available. The historical research would have needed repeating. Olivia Harrison has continued thoughtful stewardship. She's researched historical photographs to understand original selections. She's worked with specialists to establish appropriate species in key areas. But full recreation of the museum concept remains impractical. What survives demonstrates the scale of the vision. The basic geography created, the paths, the divisions, the framework, still shapes the property. Modern work occupies spaces designated for specific purposes. The bones of the design endure even when particular specimens don't. The museum represented Victorian ambition at its most scholarly. Not merely creating beautiful grounds, but documenting history through careful reproduction. Preserving medieval and Elizabethan schemes that were disappearing. Sharing Japanese design principles with Western audiences. He succeeded in creating something genuinely educational. For 30 years, visitors could walk through history, experience medieval herb cultivation, see Elizabethan geometric designs, study authentic Japanese landscape principles, all within a single Oxfordshire estate. The achievement demonstrated what one person with sufficient resources, knowledge, and determination could accomplish. Frank moved beyond typical Victorian horticulture into something approaching botanical archaeology, reconstructing historical landscapes based on period sources with scholarly precision. That achievement, even partially preserved, continues to shape Friar Park. The property remains a place where landscape history lives in physical form, where Victorian scholarship translated into living collections, where one man's obsession with accuracy and education created something truly unique. Chapter 8: Crisps, Humor, and Inscriptions. Throughout Friar Park, Frank embedded his personality into stone, wood, and terracotta. Text covered the property: Latin phrases, English mottos, puns, riddles, wordplay. Everywhere visitors looked, they encountered words carved into surfaces, challenging them to read, interpret, and often laugh. This wasn't mere decoration. The carved messages were integral to his vision. He wanted his estate to speak, to engage people intellectually as well as visually, to surprise them with unexpected humor in formal settings. The friar motif dominated. Despite the name having no religious origins, he made friars the recurring theme, not reverent religious imagery. Playful, irreverent representations that poked fun at Victorian propriety. The most famous example stood outside the main entrance, a carved friar holding a battered frying pan. The caption read, "Two Holy Friars." The joke was immediate: 2 holes in the frying pan, 2 holy friars. A visual pun literally set in stone at the threshold of a grand Victorian mansion. This established the tone. Guests understood immediately that this property wouldn't be stuffy or overly serious. The owner had a sense of humor and wasn't afraid to display it prominently. Friar figures appeared throughout the grounds: stone versions, terracotta versions, friars carved into architectural details, friars on gate piers with tongues sticking out, friars in various poses and expressions. Some were dignified. Others were comical. Many were deliberately bizarre. Facial expressions that were unsettling or strange rather than conventionally attractive. He wasn't interested in beautiful religious imagery. He wanted figures that made people pause and react. The mermaids dressed as nuns around the fountain continued the theme. Maritime mythology combined with religious costume. The juxtaposition was absurd. That was precisely the point. Above them, dolphins with friar heads added another layer of impossibility. Fish bodies with human religious faces. The combination made no logical sense. It existed purely for the surprise and humor of encountering something so unexpected. Inside the mansion, the light switches shaped as Friar faces with noses, as switches demonstrated his commitment to integrating humor into every detail. Victorian guests had to pick a friar's nose to illuminate rooms. The action was undignified, mildly vulgar, completely in character. The carved messages throughout the property ranged from serious wisdom to clever wordplay. On the floor of the entrance vestibule, a Latin phrase translated, "Tell not all you know. He who tells all that he knows often tells more than he knows." This was genuine advice about discretion, but it was also self-referential. Frank was telling people not to tell everything while simultaneously telling them this through carved text. The layered meaning was typical of his approach. In the entrance hall, 2 aphorisms appeared on the walls. One read, "Scan not a friend with microscopic glass. You know his faults, then let his foibles pass." This reflected his professional interest in microscopy while delivering moral advice. The reference to microscopic glass was literal. He owned microscopes and published papers on the subject. But the metaphor extended to examining friends' characters. Don't scrutinize too closely. Accept imperfections. The other stated, "Life is a long enigma. True, my friend. Read on. Read on. The answer's at the end." This became the title of a song on George Harrison's 1975 album, Extra Texture. Read all about it. Harrison discovered the words carved into the hall and incorporated the exact phrasing into his lyrics. He later altered it slightly for "The answer's at the end." The massive fireplace in the Jacobean Hall displayed lines from Alfred Lord Tennyson's 1850 poem, "Ring Out Wild Bells" from In Memoriam A.H.H. "Ring out the old, ring in the new, ring out the false, ring in the true." Tennyson's poem was written after the death of his close friend, Arthur Hallam. The verses about change and renewal resonated with Victorian audiences. Frank chose these specific lines for their hopeful message about progression and truth. George Harrison found these words in the fireplace and wrote them directly into his 1974 hit, Ding Dong Ding Dong. The song's chorus came straight from the carved text, "Ring out the old, ring in the new, ring out the false, ring in the true." Harrison later said discovering Frank's messages throughout Friar Park influenced his songwriting and thinking. The words embedded in the architecture spoke across decades, inspiring new creative work long after the Victorian era. Outside, throughout the grounds, additional text appeared on benches, gates, walls, and features. Some were in Latin, requiring educated guests to translate. Others were in English but used archaic phrasing or spelling. Many were chronograms, phrases where certain letters, when added together as Roman numerals, revealed dates. The main entrance chronogram indicated 1895, the year of completion. But the letters were distributed throughout the text, requiring careful attention to identify them. He loved these intellectual puzzles. He didn't want passive guests who merely looked at beautiful surroundings. He wanted engaged observers who read, thought, translated, and solved riddles. The "Don't Keep Off the Grass" sign near the entrance gates became legendary. The double negative confused everyone. People stood debating the meaning. Was walking on the grass permitted or forbidden? The ambiguity was deliberate. He wanted uncertainty, questioning, discussion amongst guests about the proper interpretation. The sign served no practical purpose. It existed purely to create that moment of confusion and conversation. Elsewhere, he placed signs with similarly perplexing messages. Yesterday today was tomorrow. Tomorrow today will be yesterday. This appeared on the Gardener's Lodge clock tower. Technically accurate. Philosophically interesting. Practically useless. Exactly the kind of wordplay he enjoyed. The sundials scattered throughout the property bore various messages. Some were traditional Latin mottos about time's passage. Others were his own compositions mixing wisdom and humor. One warned, "Use the present. Trust not the future." Another observed, "Life is the shadow of death." A third offered encouragement, "Light after darkness." The range ran from memento mori reminders of mortality to optimistic assurances about hope. The variety reflected his complex personality. He could be serious and playful, philosophical and silly, profound and ridiculous, often simultaneously. In the caves, additional text appeared carved into walls, more Latin phrases, more puzzles. Even underground, surrounded by artificial formations and optical illusions, observers encountered his voice through written words. Some provided information, labels identifying specific areas or features, explanations of historical references, educational content that enhanced understanding. Others were purely decorative or humorous, jokes that had nothing to do with the surrounding space, random observations, quotations from literature or poetry that he simply enjoyed. The cumulative effect was a property that constantly spoke. Every path, every building, every feature included language that engaged people intellectually. Walking Friar Park meant reading as much as observing. This approach was unusual for Victorian estates. Most relied on visual beauty and landscape design. Text, when present, was typically limited to necessary labels or traditional mottos. He made language a central design element equal in importance to plants and architecture. The carved words also preserved his voice across time. Long after his death, observers could still read his thoughts, jokes, and wisdom. The permanent text remained when other elements changed or disappeared. George Harrison recognized this immediately. He saw personality embedded throughout the property. The humor, intelligence, and playfulness that shaped every detail. Harrison felt he was inheriting not just a physical estate, but a philosophical approach, a way of seeing the world that valued surprise, learning, and joy. Harrison made the connection explicit in The Ballad of Sir Frankie Crisp, Let It Roll, from his 1970 album All Things Must Pass. The song celebrated Frank's life and vision. It acknowledged the Victorian eccentric who'd built this extraordinary place. The lyrics referenced specific Friar Park features. The song's title came from phrases carved throughout the property. Let It Roll appeared in various forms. Harrison was literally singing Frank's words back to him across 7 decades. Harrison told interviewers that Frank helped my awareness. Whatever it was I felt became stronger, or found more expression by moving into that house, because everything stepped up or was heightened. The carved messages contributed to this. Constant reminders to think, question, and engage. The humor in the text provided relief from Victorian formality. Grand estates could be intimidating. Overwhelming displays of wealth and taste that made ordinary people feel inadequate. The jokes and puns humanized the space, made it approachable, signaled that this was a place for enjoyment, not just solemn appreciation. The wordplay also demonstrated education and wit. Victorian culture valued clever language. Puns weren't considered low humor as they sometimes are now. They were respected forms of intellectual play. The linguistic jokes showed learning while entertaining. The religious imagery, friars, nuns, biblical references, wasn't devotional. Frank wasn't particularly religious, but Victorian England was saturated with Christian symbolism. He appropriated these familiar images and twisted them into something playful rather than pious. This was mildly subversive, not shocking enough to offend seriously, but unexpected enough to surprise. Using religious figures for jokes and puns challenged the solemnity typically associated with such imagery. The Friar theme also provided unity. Despite the property's diversity, Japanese areas, medieval sections, alpine rockery, various architectural styles, the recurring friars tied everything together. They became a signature. Observers knew they were at Friar Park because friars appeared everywhere in unexpected ways. After his death, the carved text endured better than many physical elements. Stone and wood lasted. The language remained legible even when surrounding contexts changed. Buildings might be repurposed, landscapes might be altered, but the permanent messages persisted. When the nuns occupied the property, some text must have seemed odd. Religious women living in a space where friars were jokes. where religious imagery was playful rather than reverent. But the permanence of carved language meant it survived this period intact. George Harrison appreciated and preserved it. He understood these elements were essential to the property's character. He referenced them in songs, showed them to guests, made sure people understood the humor and intelligence behind them. Olivia Harrison has continued this preservation. The text is maintained, photographed, documented. It's recognized as important historical and cultural content, not just decorative details. The words carved into Friar Park remain the most direct communication with future generations. They speak in his voice, express his personality, share his jokes, wisdom, and obsessions. More than the architecture or landscapes, the language makes Frank present. It's proof that this extraordinary estate came from one person's mind, that the humor, learning, and playfulness weren't accidental. They were deliberate choices by someone who wanted his property to challenge, surprise, and delight. The permanent text ensures that Frank, Victorian lawyer and eccentric, remains very much alive at Friar Park. His voice, carved in stone, continues speaking to everyone who visits, still making jokes, still offering wisdom, still insisting that people think, read, question, and smile. And somewhere among those carved phrases, perhaps his greatest message remains: that beauty alone isn't enough. The best spaces engage the mind as well as the eye. The finest estates teach as well as please. The most memorable places have personality, quirky, intelligent, humorous, unmistakably human. That's what the text provides. Humanity embedded in stone. One man's voice speaking across time. Words that outlasted everything else, still echoing through the grounds, still making observers pause, read, think, and laugh, just as he intended. Chapter 9, From Death to Decline, 1919 to 1970. On April 29, 1919, at the age of 75, Frank died. The funeral took place at the parish church of St. Mary the Virgin in Henley-on-Thames. The service was filled with mourners, including representatives of the many societies and institutions with which he'd been connected: the Royal Horticultural Society, the Linnean Society, the Royal Microscopical Society, legal colleagues from Ashurst, Morris, and Crisp, friends from decades of social and professional relationships. His grave is marked by a pillar in a prominent position at Fairmile Cemetery. The stone bears an epitaph derived from the first verse of a poem written in 1879 by Edward H. Parker for a friend's funeral. Life's race well run, life's work well done, life's victory won, now cometh rest. The words captured Victorian attitudes toward accomplished lives, a successful man who'd worked hard, achieved much, and earned peaceful rest. Frank had indeed accomplished extraordinary things: a distinguished legal career, a baronetcy, and the creation of one of England's most remarkable estates. But with his death, Friar Park's golden age ended. The property required constant attention and substantial expense. The 45 gardeners, the maintenance of complex water systems, the specialized care for thousands of plant specimens, the upkeep of the mansion and lodges, the electrical and mechanical systems. Everything depended on someone willing and able to fund the operation. Frank's family didn't want that burden. In August 1919, just months after his death, the entire estate was put up for auction. The catalog described the property in detail: the mansion, the lodges, 3 grand residential sites, the boathouse on the Thames, extensive grounds with extraordinary features. The auction took place on Saturday, August 9th, 1919. The property sold to Sir Percival David, a wealthy financier and connoisseur of Chinese art. David was an interesting figure. Born in 1892 to a wealthy Bombay merchant family, he'd developed a passion for Chinese ceramics and porcelain. He would eventually donate his extraordinary collection to the University of London, where it became the Percival David Foundation of Chinese Art. But his interest in Friar Park wasn't primarily about the gardens or Victorian eccentricity. He needed a substantial country estate appropriate to his wealth and social position. Friar Park provided that. David made some modifications, but largely maintained the property as Frank had left it. The gardening staff was reduced somewhat but remained substantial. The basic operations continued. The gardens were maintained, though perhaps not with the same obsessive attention to detail Frank had demanded. David lived at Friar Park through the 1920s and into the 1930s. He entertained guests, enjoyed the grounds, added elements of his own taste. But he wasn't creating or innovating the way Frank had. He was preserving and inhabiting what someone else had built. His marriage to Isabel Rose ended in divorce in 1953. The separation created complications for the property. Lady David remained in England, moving into what had been called the Upper Lodge, but was remodeled as Friar Park End, combining the coachman's cottage with the stable courtyard into a separate residence. Sir Percival David didn't want to maintain the main house and extensive grounds alone. The property was too large, too expensive, too demanding of time and resources. He was primarily interested in his art collection and scholarly pursuits, not in managing a complex Victorian estate. He made a remarkable decision. He donated the main property, the mansion and most of the grounds, to a Catholic teaching order called the Salesian Sisters of St. John Bosco. The Salesians of Don Bosco were founded in Italy in the 19th century. The order focused on education, particularly for disadvantaged youth. They ran schools throughout Europe and had established a presence in England. The nuns accepted the property gratefully. They already operated the Sacred Heart School in Henley. Friar Park would provide much more substantial facilities. The mansion could house students. The grounds could serve educational purposes. The location was ideal. For the Salesian sisters, Friar Park was a gift. They hadn't sought such a grand property. But once offered, it provided extraordinary opportunities for their educational mission. They moved in during the 1950s. The mansion became a convent school. Classrooms occupied rooms that had been drawing rooms and libraries. Dormitories filled chambers that had hosted Victorian house guests. The ballroom served institutional functions. The nuns were practical people with limited resources. They maintained the building adequately, but couldn't preserve all of Frank's elaborate features. Some of the interior decorative elements were simplified or removed. The focus was on functional education, not historical preservation. The grounds presented even greater challenges. The order couldn't afford 45 gardeners. They couldn't maintain the specialized themed gardens. They lacked expertise in Japanese design principles, alpine plant cultivation, and Victorian landscape management. The gardens began to decline almost immediately. Not from neglect exactly. The nuns did what they could with available resources. But maintaining Friar Park properly required specialized knowledge and substantial funding. The order had neither. The Japanese section grew wild. Without proper pruning and care according to Japanese principles, it lost its distinct character. Trees and shrubs grew unpruned. Stone placements became obscured by vegetation. The tea house deteriorated. The medieval and Elizabethan gardens disappeared. The specific planting schemes were lost. The raised beds remained, but were planted with whatever was practical rather than historically accurate species. The educational and scholarly character vanished. The topiary grew out of shape. Maintaining sculptural forms requires regular trimming by people who understand the intended shapes. Without that attention, the carefully clipped peacocks and pyramids became overgrown bushes. The rose garden survived better. Roses are relatively forgiving. They continue blooming even with basic care. But the collection's diversity declined. Rare cultivars were lost. The display remained pleasant but no longer extraordinary. The rockery presented particular challenges. Alpine plants are demanding. They require excellent drainage, specific soil conditions, and understanding of their needs. Without knowledgeable care, specimens died. Weeds invaded. Common plants colonized spaces where rare alpines had grown. Trees seeded themselves throughout the rockery. Without removal, these became established. By the 1960s, substantial trees grew among the stone formations. The carefully engineered alpine environment was becoming woodland. The water systems continued functioning but received minimal maintenance. pumps ran when necessary for basic operations. But the decorative elements, the stepping stones, the fountain features, the various effects Frank had created, were neglected. The stepping stones became slippery with algae. The optical illusion still worked technically, but the stones weren't safe to walk on without cleaning. The trick that had delighted Victorian guests became hazardous. The cave systems were largely abandoned. The electrical installations were outdated and potentially dangerous. The refrigeration for the ice grotto stopped working. The underground passages flooded in places. The decorative elements deteriorated. The blue grotto effect no longer functioned. The vine cave's glass berries were broken or missing. The gnome collection was scattered. Some pieces were lost. Others were removed or stored away. The underground wonderland became just damp passages best avoided. The lodges remained occupied by staff or were rented out. They were maintained as functional residences. But the architectural details received less attention. Paint faded. Minor repairs were deferred. The buildings remained sound but lost some of their Victorian luster. The mansion itself weathered this period reasonably well. The basic structure was solid. The Silesians kept the roof intact and the building weatherproof. But interior details suffered. The carved woodwork wasn't properly maintained. Stained glass windows developed damage. The elaborate decorative elements accumulated decades of grime. By the late 1960s, the order faced difficult decisions. The school wasn't thriving. Enrollment had declined. The building required expensive repairs the order couldn't afford. The grounds had become overwhelming to manage. Friar Park had become a burden rather than an asset. The nuns hadn't wanted to give up such a historic property. But continuing to operate there wasn't sustainable. Rumors circulated that the property might be demolished. The mansion was awkward to adapt for modern purposes, too large for a single residence, expensive to convert into apartments, difficult to heat and maintain. The grounds were similarly problematic, too extensive for typical residential use, requiring constant expensive maintenance. The demolition rumors were probably exaggerated, but they reflected real concerns about the property's future. Victorian eccentricity wasn't fashionable in the 1960s. Grand country houses were being torn down throughout England. Estates that seemed permanent were disappearing. Friar Park's fate hung uncertain. Would someone want this peculiar property? Would anyone have resources and interest to restore what had been lost? Would Frank's extraordinary creation survive into a new era, or be lost to changing times? The property in early 1970 was a shadow of what Frank had created. The basic geography remained: the mansion, the lodges, the paths, the bones of the landscape. But the life had gone out of it. The gardens were overgrown, the features were neglected, the personality had faded. Lady David still lived at Friar Park End, the remodeled upper lodge. She'd been there since her divorce nearly 2 decades earlier. She maintained her portion of the original property, but the main estate was separate from her small holding. Inside the mansion, grass grew up through floorboards in some rooms. Not everywhere. The Silesians had maintained inhabited areas, but parts of the large building had been unused for years. Nature was reclaiming spaces that had been neglected. The grounds were similarly wild, not picturesque English countryside, but tangled, overgrown vegetation that obscured paths and features. Walking through the property required machetes to cut through undergrowth. This was how George Harrison's sister-in-law, Irene, would later describe it: impassable without tools to hack through the growth. Friar Park had declined dramatically in the 50 years since Frank's death. From being one of England's most remarkable estates, famous in horticultural circles, visited by enthusiasts, maintained by dozens of skilled staff, to an overgrown property with an uncertain future. The decline wasn't unique. Many Victorian estates followed similar trajectories. Built during an era of cheap labor and substantial wealth, they became unsustainable as economic conditions changed. The gardens that required 45 full-time staff couldn't survive when those resources disappeared. But Friar Park's decline was particularly poignant because what was being lost was so extraordinary. Not just another Victorian country house, but a museum of gardens, a scholarly creation filled with historical reproductions and botanical collections, a property that embodied one person's vision, humor, and intelligence at every turn. By January 1970, Friar Park needed rescue. It needed someone willing to take on a massive restoration project, someone who could appreciate what Frank had created, someone with resources to fund the work, someone who saw possibility rather than just overwhelming problems. And that person was about to arrive. Chapter 10: Harrison's Rescue and Legacy. In January 1970, George Harrison was 27 years old and looking for a new home. He'd been living at Kinfauns in Esher, Surrey, a bungalow he'd purchased in 1964. But he wanted something larger, more private, a place where he could escape the intense scrutiny that came with being a Beatle. His lawyer contacted real estate agents. The requirements were specific: substantial grounds for privacy, space for a recording studio, distance from London but not too far, a property with character, not just another modern house. Friar Park came on the market at exactly the right moment. The asking price was £140,000. For a Victorian mansion, 3 lodges, 30 acres of historic grounds, and countless extraordinary features, this was remarkably affordable. The property's condition, overgrown, neglected, requiring massive restoration, depressed the value. Most potential buyers saw overwhelming problems. Harrison saw possibility. He viewed the property with his first wife, Patty Boyd. His sister-in-law Irene accompanied them. When they drove through the gates and saw the lower lodge, Irene assumed that was the house. She thought it looked beautiful. Then they continued up the drive and saw the actual mansion. The scale was staggering. The grounds were jungle-like. Irene later recalled, "You didn't go for a walk without a machete in your hand to cut your way through." Trees and undergrowth obscured paths. Features were hidden beneath vegetation. The rockery had become overgrown woodland. The careful plantings Frank had created were buried under decades of neglect. Inside the mansion, conditions were equally dramatic. Grass grew up through floorboards in unused rooms. Paint peeled from walls. Years of institutional use by the convent school had taken their toll. The elaborate Victorian interiors were grimy and damaged. But Harrison saw beyond the decay. He recognized something extraordinary. The bones of Frank's creation remained intact. The architecture, the basic landscape structure, the caves, the lakes, the Matterhorn replica. Everything was still there, just hidden and deteriorating. More importantly, Harrison connected with Frank's spirit. He discovered the inscriptions throughout the property, read the mottos carved into stone and wood, found the humor in the friar figures and visual puns, recognized a kindred spirit, someone who valued surprise, intelligence, and playfulness. He purchased Friar Park in January 1970 for £140,000. Then he began the enormous task of restoration. The work would consume years, not months. Years of effort, resources, and determination to revive what had been lost and preserve what remained. The first challenge was the grounds. 30 acres of overgrown vegetation couldn't be tackled conventionally. The scale was too large, the undergrowth too thick. Traditional landscaping crews would take forever. Harrison brought in goats. The animals cleared undergrowth on the steep slopes of the rockery where machinery couldn't easily operate. They ate their way through years of accumulated growth, revealing the underlying stone formations and paths. He employed gardeners with machetes and clearing tools to reclaim paths and open up sightlines. Slowly, the basic geography emerged from beneath the overgrowth. The terraces, the steps, the major features, the framework Frank had created became visible again. The rockery required particular attention. Trees that had seeded themselves among the formations needed removal. Some were substantial. Years of growth had produced sizable specimens. Removing them without damaging the carefully placed stones was delicate work. Weeds and invasive species were cleared from between formations. The soil pockets were cleaned and replanted. Not necessarily with the same rare alpines Frank had collected. Many of those were extinct or unavailable, but with appropriate species that would thrive and look correct. The Matterhorn replica stood firm. The sandstone had weathered but remained structurally sound. The quartz snowcap had largely washed away over decades, but the distinctive pyramidal form was intact. It still dominated the rockery, just as Frank had intended. The water systems required significant work. The pumps needed replacing. The waterfalls needed clearing of decades of accumulated debris. The lake edges required repair where pulimite had crumbled. The Japanese bridge needed restoration. The stepping stones that created the walking on water illusion were cleaned and stabilized. The trick worked again once the stones were properly maintained. Harrison would later use this feature in his promotional video for Crackerbox Palace in 1976, Victorian illusion meeting modern film technology. The fountain on the terrace, Ye Fountain of Perpetual Mirth, was cleaned and repaired. Harrison added a Hindu statue to the center. He also positioned German garden gnomes around the perimeter. These weren't random decorative choices. He'd researched Frank's original design and knew gnomes had been integral to the Victorian vision. In fact, Harrison made efforts to locate and recover original gnomes from Frank's collection. Many had been scattered or sold during the decline years. He tracked down what he could find and returned them to Friar Park. Some of these recovered gnomes appeared in the famous photograph for his 1970 album, All Things Must Pass. Harrison sitting on the lawn, surrounded by 4 gnomes. The photograph was taken by Barry Feinstein. Harrison's casual pose among the garden ornaments became iconic. The image connected directly to Frank's legacy. These were the gnomes that had populated the caves and grounds during the Victorian era, now accompanying a Beatle on an album that would define post-Beatles solo work. The mansion required extensive interior restoration. Structural repairs came first: the roof, the windows, the basic weatherproofing that had been neglected. Then interior work began. Cleaning, repairing woodwork, restoring damaged features, bringing the elaborate Victorian spaces back to life. Harrison preserved Frank's inscriptions carefully. He recognized their importance. The words carved throughout the property weren't just decoration. They were Frank's voice speaking across decades. Harrison read them repeatedly, found inspiration in them, incorporated them into his songs. The ballad of Sir Frankie Crisp, Let It Roll, appeared on All Things Must Pass. The song celebrated Frank directly. Harrison had researched the Victorian eccentric who'd built his new home. He felt connected to that creative spirit. The song expressed gratitude and recognition across time. Ding Dong from his 1974 album Dark Horse took lyrics directly from Tennyson's lines carved into the Jacobean Hall fireplace. Ring out the old, ring in the new, ring out the false, ring in the true. What Frank had carved in stone became Harrison's chorus. The answers at the end, from Extra Texture, read all about it, in 1975 came from another carved inscription. Harrison found these Victorian words relevant to his own life and philosophy. The messages spoke to him personally. In early 1972, Harrison installed a recording studio in a guest suite. Initially 16-track tape-based, the facility was at one point superior to EMI's Abbey Road studios in technical capabilities. This was remarkable. A home studio outperforming the most famous professional facility in rock music. The studio was named FPSHOT, Friar Park Studio, Henley-on-Thames. The acronym appeared on album covers for projects recorded there. All Things Must Pass had been recorded elsewhere, but subsequent Harrison albums carried the FPSHOT designation. Living in the Material World in 1973 was the first major album fully recorded at Friar Park, then Dark Horse in 1974, Extra Texture in 1975, 33 1/3 in 1976, George Harrison in 1979, Somewhere in England in 1981, Gone Troppo in 1982, Cloud9 in 1987, Brainwashed, recorded before his death and released posthumously in 2002. By 1974, FP Shot had become headquarters for Harrison's record label, Dark Horse Records. The label signed and produced other artists. The studio at Friar Park became a destination for musicians. A place where significant work happened away from commercial pressures and traditional studio environments. The Traveling Wilburys recorded overdubs at Friar Park. The Beatles' Anthology project in 1995 used the studio. Ravi Shankar's Chants of India was recorded and produced there by Harrison in 1996. Countless other projects utilized the facility over 3 decades. Musicians who recorded at Friar Park often stayed in the middle lodge. The band Splinter occupied it during sessions. Klaus Voormann lived there for a period. The lodges that Frank had built for staff became accommodations for visiting artists working on projects. Harrison treated Friar Park as more than just a home or studio. He saw himself as a caretaker. His role was preserving what Frank had created while adding his own layer to the property's history. He respected the Victorian vision while living and working there as a 20th century musician. He told interviewers that Frank had influenced his thinking, that living at Friar Park heightened his awareness, that the estate's atmosphere affected his creativity, the inscriptions, the humor, the intelligence embedded in every detail. These elements shaped Harrison's experience of the place. Harrison's personal life at Friar Park included his daughter Donnie, born in 1978 to his second wife Olivia. Donnie grew up at the estate. He would later describe his father gardening at night by moonlight, working in the grounds until midnight. Harrison's connection to the landscape was deep and personal. Tragically, in December 1999, Harrison was attacked in his home at Friar Park by an intruder. He suffered serious injuries but survived. The incident brought unwanted attention to the property and raised security concerns. But Harrison remained committed to the estate despite the trauma. He died of cancer on November 29, 2001, in Los Angeles. He was 58 years old. His cremated remains were scattered in India according to Hindu tradition. But Friar Park remained. Olivia Harrison inherited the property. She continued the restoration work her husband had begun 3 decades earlier. She researched historical photographs and documents to understand Frank's original plantings. She consulted specialists in Victorian landscape design. She worked to return features closer to their original character. Under Olivia's stewardship, the grounds have been maintained and enhanced. The rockery is cleared and properly cared for. The water features function correctly. The mansion is preserved. The lodges are maintained. The studio continues operating for selected projects. Olivia has spoken publicly about the estate and its history. She gave interviews for Martin Scorsese's documentary, George Harrison Living in the Material World, in 2011. These were filmed at Friar Park, showing the property and discussing its significance to Harrison's life and work. She's worked with organizations documenting Victorian gardens and architecture. Friar Park is listed Grade 2 by Historic England, recognized as a building of special interest. The gardens are separately listed Grade 2 on the Register of Historic Parks and Gardens. The lodges and various features each have individual Grade 2 listings. This official recognition ensures some protection. Major changes require permission from heritage authorities. The property can't be demolished or significantly altered without approval. Frank's creation has formal status as part of England's architectural and landscape heritage. Friar Park remains a private residence. It's not open to the public for tours. The family maintains privacy carefully. But the property's cultural significance is acknowledged. Books have been published about its history. Documentaries have featured it. The connection between Victorian eccentricity and rock music history fascinates people. The estate represents an unusual continuity. Frank created it between 1889 and 1919. It declined from 1919 to 1970. Harrison rescued it from 1970 to 2001. Olivia has maintained it from 2001 to the present. Over a century of history with only 3 primary caretakers. That continuity matters. Each generation has added to rather than erasing what came before. Harrison didn't modernize Friar Park into something unrecognizable. He restored Frank's vision while adding the studio that enabled his own creative work. Olivia has preserved both layers, the Victorian foundation and the rock music history. The property demonstrates that historic estates can evolve without losing essential character. That restoration doesn't mean freezing things in the past. that creative people can inhabit and enhance what previous generations built. Frank would likely have appreciated Harrison's presence at Friar Park. Both were creative people who valued surprise and intelligence. Both embedded their personalities into spaces they inhabited. Both wanted to share what they'd created with others through guidebooks, albums, or tours. The inscriptions Frank carved still speak. The features he designed still function. The landscape structure he created still shapes the experience. A century after his death, his presence remains tangible throughout the property, and now Harrison's presence is layered over that. The studio where he recorded, the gnomes he recovered and photographed, the songs inspired by carved words, the years of restoration work, the commitment to preservation. Friar Park endures because two creative people, separated by 8 decades, both recognized something worth preserving. Both invested time, resources, and energy into maintaining and enhancing what they'd inherited. Both saw the property as more than just real estate. The Victorian lawyer and the beadle never met, but they connected across time through a shared estate, through inscriptions that inspired songs, through humor embedded in stone, through a commitment to creating spaces that surprise, challenge, and delight. That connection ensures Friar Park's survival, not as a museum frozen in Victorian times, not as merely a famous musician's home, but as a living place where history accumulates in layers, where Frank's 19th century vision supports 20th century creative work, where past and present coexist and enhance each other. The estate that nearly faced demolition in 1970 now stands secure, protected by heritage designations, maintained by people who understand its significance, preserved for future generations who will discover Frank's inscriptions, walk the paths Harrison cleared, and experience the extraordinary place where Victorian eccentricity and rock music history intertwine. Friar Park remains what it has always been, the most remarkable private estate in England, where one person's vision created something that transcends any single lifetime, where humor, intelligence, and creativity are permanently embedded in stone, wood, and landscape, where the past speaks directly to the present through carefully carved words that still echo across the grounds, just as Frank intended, just as Harrison understood, just as Olivia preserves. The Museum of Gardens survives, changed, evolved, but recognizably itself, still surprising, still teaching, still delighting everyone fortunate enough to experience it.